The email subject line read, "Performance Review. Final Decision." Inside, the words were clinical and cold. "While we appreciate your contributions, budget constraints prevent salary adjustments at this time. We encourage continued dedication to your role." It was the third year in a row. 3 years of watching less experienced colleagues get promoted while I stayed frozen at the same pay grade. 3 years of hearing vague promises about next quarter, and when things stabilize. I sat in my cubicle at Sterling Pharmaceuticals, staring at the screen until the words blurred. Around me, the office hummed with its usual rhythm, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, the coffee machine gurgling in the break room. Nobody knew that this email had just changed everything. My manager, Patricia Kendall, had signed off with her usual pleasantry. "Keep up the excellent work." The irony wasn't lost on me. Excellent work that apparently wasn't worth paying for. I closed my laptop slowly, feeling something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, but a cold, clarifying certainty. I'd spent 5 years building something invaluable here, and they had no idea what they were about to lose. My name is Jane Torres, and I joined Sterling Pharmaceuticals right out of graduate school with a degree in biochemical engineering. The job seemed perfect, a small but growing company developing innovative drug delivery systems. I was hired as a research analyst, tasked with documenting experimental procedures and maintaining our proprietary database of formulation protocols. It sounded mundane on paper, but I quickly realized I had access to the company's entire intellectual backbone. The database was a mess when I started. Years of inconsistent documentation, missing test results, conflicting version numbers. My predecessor had apparently kept half the information in her head and the other half in scattered Excel files. Within my first 6 months, I'd rebuilt the entire system from scratch. I created a searchable digital archive, established standardized protocols, and developed a tracking system that linked every formulation to its test results and regulatory requirements. Patricia had praised my initiative back then. "You're a natural problem solver, Jane," she'd said during my first review. I'd expected that praise to translate into recognition. Instead, it translated into more work without more pay. By year 2, I'd become indispensable in ways that weren't in my job description. Scientists would knock on my cubicle asking for specific formulation data from trials conducted years ago. I could pull it up in minutes. The regulatory team relied on my documentation when preparing FDA submissions. The quality control department used my tracking system to identify batch inconsistencies. I'd essentially become the institutional memory of Sterling's research division. But when review time came, Patricia had excuses ready. "The company's going through a transition," she'd explained, not meeting my eyes. "Everyone's tightening belts. Once we secure the new funding round, we'll revisit compensation." I believed her then. I'd actually believed that my contributions were being noticed and that patience would pay off. I'd even volunteered for additional projects, thinking it would strengthen my case. I'd reorganized the entire archive of clinical trial data, creating cross-references that cut research time by 40%. I'd trained 3 new hires on the systems I'd built. I'd stayed late countless nights ensuring that urgent requests were handled before morning meetings. And still nothing changed. Year 3 brought a particularly bitter pill. Sterling hired a new research coordinator, someone Patricia knew from her previous company. His name was Derek, fresh MBA, no pharmaceutical experience, and he started at a salary I knew was 15% higher than mine. I knew because our HR system had a glaring security flaw, one I'd noticed but never reported. When you're the person managing data systems, you see things. Derek spent his first month asking me basic questions about our processes. I showed him how to navigate the database, explained the regulatory requirements, and walked him through the documentation standards I'd established. He was friendly enough, but there was an awkward dynamic. He clearly sensed I should have been his peer, maybe even his supervisor, based on my knowledge. But organizationally, we were at the same level except he was making significantly more. I watched Patricia mentor Derek in ways she'd never mentored me. Long conversations in her office, invitations to strategy meetings, introductions to senior leadership. When I'd asked to attend those same meetings in the past, I'd been told they were above my pay grade. The irony was suffocating. The third rejection email landed 2 weeks after I'd completed the most critical project of my career at Sterling. We were preparing for an FDA audit of our entire drug development process, a make-or-break moment for the company's flagship product. I'd spent 4 months preparing documentation packages, ensuring every formulation record was complete and compliant, and creating presentation materials that demonstrated our quality systems. The audit had gone flawlessly. The FDA inspector had actually complimented the organization of our records, calling it exemplary in his written feedback. Patricia had forwarded his comments to the entire department, adding her own note. Thanks to everyone for their hard work. No names mentioned, no specific acknowledgement. Just a generic thank you that bundled my months of intensive work into a collective pat on the back. That's when I'd formally requested a salary review, citing the project's success and my 5 years of contributions. I'd prepared a detailed presentation showing the value I'd added, complete with metrics and testimonials from colleagues. Patricia had listened politely, nodded in seemingly all the right places, and promised to take it up the chain. 3 weeks later, the rejection email arrived. I sat in my car in the parking garage that evening, hands gripping the steering wheel, engine off. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the concrete pillars. I'd cried earlier, hot, frustrated tears that surprised me with their intensity. Now I just felt empty and resolved. 5 years of loyalty had earned me nothing but more responsibility without more respect. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through job listings. I'd looked before, half-heartedly, always telling myself that things would improve at Sterling. But this time felt different. This time I wasn't just browsing, I was hunting. My expertise in pharmaceutical data systems was specialized enough to be valuable but broad enough to transfer across companies. I had skills that Sterling had taken for granted but that other companies would recognize. Within an hour, I'd identified 3 positions at competing firms. Each offered at least 30% more than my current salary, along with better benefits and clearer advancement paths. I drafted cover letters that night, sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of wine and a sense of grim purpose. I didn't mention Sterling by name, but I made sure to highlight every system I'd built, every efficiency I'd created. The next morning, I walked into Sterling with a smile fixed firmly on my face. I greeted Patricia cheerfully when passing her office, responded to Derek's questions with my usual helpfulness, and went through my tasks with mechanical precision. But inside, something had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer working for Sterling's benefit. I was working for my exit strategy. I started documenting everything with a new purpose. Not just the formulation data and research protocols, but my own processes. I created detailed guides explaining how I'd built the database architecture, how the search algorithms worked, and how the regulatory cross-references were structured. Ostensibly, this was for knowledge transfer and business continuity. The kind of thing any responsible employee would do. But I knew the truth. These documents would be my insurance policy. What I didn't document was the intuitive understanding that came from 5 years of immersion in the system. I didn't explain the workarounds for the database's quirks, the specific search terms that yielded the best results, or the unofficial connections between datasets that I discovered through experience. That knowledge stayed in my head where it belonged, to me. 2 weeks after I'd submitted my applications, I got a call from a recruiter representing Meridian Biotech, one of Sterling's main competitors. They were expanding their research operations and needed someone to overhaul their data management systems. The job description could have been written specifically for me. The recruiter's voice was warm and enthusiastic as she described the role, the team, the company culture. Your background is exactly what we're looking for, she said. When can you come in for an interview? I scheduled it for the following week, taking a personal day without telling anyone at Sterling where I'd really be. The Meridian offices were sleek and modern, a stark contrast to Sterling's dated facility. The interview panel included the research director, the head of quality assurance, and a senior data architect. They asked intelligent questions, actually listened to my answers, and seemed genuinely impressed by my experience. "We've heard Sterling has excellent data systems," the research director noted. "I'm guessing you had something to do with that?" I smiled modestly, confirming but not boasting. By the end of the interview, I could sense their interest. They walked me through their current challenges: disorganized records, inefficient processes, regulatory concerns. Everything I'd already solved at Sterling. "How soon could you start?" the research director asked. The job offer arrived within 3 days. The salary was 35% higher than what I currently made, with performance bonuses, better health insurance, and a clear promotion track. They wanted me to start in 4 weeks. I read the offer letter 3 times, feeling a mixture of vindication and excitement. This was real. This was my exit. I drafted my resignation letter that evening, keeping it professional and brief. "I'm writing to inform you of my resignation, effective 2 weeks from today. I'm grateful for the opportunities I've had at Sterling and wish the company continued success." No mention of the raised denials, the frustration, the years of being undervalued. Just a clean, courteous goodbye. The hard part was deciding what to tell Patricia. Part of me wanted to list every grievance, to make her understand exactly what her decisions had cost the company. But I knew that would accomplish nothing except making me look bitter. Better to leave with dignity and let the consequences speak for themselves. I saved the letter in my drafts folder, planning to submit it the next morning. That night I barely slept. The anticipation was electric. I arrived early the next day, before Patricia usually got in. I wanted to submit my resignation via email first, creating a paper trail, before having the face-to-face conversation. At 7:30 I hit send, watching the message disappear into the ether. Then I waited, forcing myself to focus on routine tasks while my stomach churned with nervous energy. Patricia arrived at 8:15, her usual time. I watched through the gaps in my cubicle as she settled into her office, booted up her computer and started checking email. It took approximately 4 minutes before I heard her footsteps approaching my desk. "Jane, can I see you in my office?" Her voice was tight, controlled. I grabbed my notebook, more as a prop than anything else, and followed her inside. She closed the door, never a good sign in office politics, and gestured to the chair across from her desk. Her face was a careful mask of professional composure, but I could see the tension in her jaw. "I got your email," she said, stating the obvious. "This is quite unexpected. Can we talk about what's prompting this decision?" I kept my voice calm and neutral. "I've accepted a position at another company. It's a good opportunity for career growth." Patricia's expression shifted, something flickering behind her eyes. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. "I see. Can you tell me which company?" I shook my head politely. "I'd prefer to keep that confidential for now." That was my right, and we both knew it. She leaned back in her chair, studying me. "Jane, if this is about the salary review, I want you to know that I fought for you. The decision came from above me. But perhaps we can revisit that now. What would it take to make you stay?" There it was, the counteroffer I'd anticipated. Too little, too late. I'd spent 3 years hearing about budget constraints and company transitions. Now, suddenly, when I was leaving, there was room to negotiate. I met her gaze steadily. "I appreciate that, Patricia, but I've made my decision. This isn't just about salary. It's about where I can grow professionally." That was diplomatic enough, skirting the real issues: the lack of recognition, the watching less qualified people get promoted, the years of feeling invisible despite being essential. Patricia's jaw tightened. She wasn't used to people saying no to her, especially not people she'd taken for granted. "I need to be frank with you, Jane. Your departure is going to create significant challenges for the team. You manage critical systems. The database, the documentation protocols. We need time to transition that knowledge." I nodded, expecting this. "I'm happy to help with the transition during my 2 weeks. I've actually been creating documentation guides for the main systems." That was technically true, though those guides were deliberately incomplete. Patricia looked relieved. Good. That's good. I'll need you to train your replacement. Kept my face neutral. Of course. Who will that be? She hesitated. We'll need to hire someone. In the meantime, Derek can handle the basics. I almost laughed. Derek, who still asked me questions about fundamental processes 3 months into his job, was going to manage the database that I'd spent 5 years building and refining. But I just nodded. Sure. I'll work with him. The lack of reaction seemed to unsettle Patricia more than arguing would have. The next 2 weeks were surreal. Word spread quickly through the office that I was leaving, and suddenly I was popular in a way I'd never been before. People I'd barely spoken to stopped by my desk, expressing surprise and asking where I was going. Some seemed genuinely sad. Others clearly just wanted gossip. The scientists who'd relied on me for data requests looked panicked. Who's going to help us find the old trial results? One asked. Smiled. Derek's taking over. He'll figure it out. I spent hours with Derek, walking him through the database interface, showing him where key documents were stored, explaining the basic search functions. He took notes frantically, filling page after page of a yellow legal pad. This is a lot, he admitted on day 3. How do you keep track of everything? Shrugged. You learn the patterns after a while. Just refer to the documentation guides I created. What I didn't tell him was that those patterns took years to internalize. That the documentation guides only covered the official processes, not the shortcuts and workarounds that made the system actually functional. That some of the most valuable datasets were tucked away in subdirectories that weren't immediately obvious unless you understood the logic of how I'd organized everything. Patricia called a meeting on my second-to-last day. Present were herself, Derek, and the head of research, Dr. Ramesh Singh. The conference room felt uncomfortably small as we squeezed around the table. Dr. Singh looked worried. He was the one who'd relied most heavily on my data retrieval skills. Jane, we want to make sure we're not missing anything critical in the handover, he began. Can you walk us through the database structure one more time? I pulled up the system on the conference room screen and gave them the official tour. Main directories, search interface, documentation standards, backup protocols. Everything by the book. Derek scribbled notes. Dr. Singh asked clarifying questions. Patricia watched me carefully, as if trying to detect some hidden resistance. But I was nothing but helpful and professional. The user manual I created covers all the standard operations, I concluded. Derek should be able to handle most routine requests. What about the non-routine requests? Dr. Singh asked, hitting the nail on the head. I smiled sympathetically. Those require more judgment and experience. Derek will develop that over time. Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly. She was smart enough to read between the lines. Derek looked nervous. I'll do my best, he said, trying to sound confident. My last day arrived with a strange mixture of relief and melancholy. I'd spent 5 years in this building, in this cubicle with these people. Despite everything, there were things I'd miss. The camaraderie with some colleagues, the satisfaction of solving complex data puzzles, even the familiar routine. But those feelings were overwhelmed by excitement for what came next and satisfaction at leaving on my own terms. Patricia had organized a small goodbye gathering in the break room, complete with grocery store cake and awkward speeches. People said nice things about my reliability and expertise. Dr. Singh gave me a gift card to a bookstore. Derek looked like he was trying not to panic. Patricia's speech was the most interesting. Jane has been an invaluable part of our team, and while we're sad to see her go, we wish her all the best in her next chapter. Invaluable. That word echoed in my head. Invaluable enough to keep, apparently, but not invaluable enough to pay appropriately. I smiled, thanked everyone, and cut the cake. Then I went back to my desk for the final pack-up. Personal photos, coffee mug, a few books. 5 years distilled into one cardboard box. I did one last check of my computer, ensuring I deleted all personal files and logged out of all systems. Then I walked out of Sterling Pharmaceuticals for the last time. Meridian Biotech welcomed me like I was the solution to all their problems. My first week was a blur of onboarding meetings, system assessments, and strategic planning sessions. The research director, Dr. Elena Vargas, gave me free rein to evaluate their current data management situation and propose solutions. "We know it's a mess," she admitted cheerfully. "That's why we hired you. Fix it however you see fit." I dove in with enthusiasm, conducting a full audit of their existing systems. It was indeed a mess. Disconnected databases, paper files mixed with digital records, no standardized protocols. But it was also a blank canvas. I could build something from scratch using everything I'd learned at Sterling, but doing it better, more efficiently, more intuitively. The problems were familiar, but this time I had resources, support, and appreciation. My new colleagues actually listened to my suggestions. When I proposed a centralized data architecture, they approved the budget immediately. When I outlined a timeline for implementation, they asked how they could help, not why it would take so long. The contrast with Sterling was stark and validating. This was what it felt like to be valued. 3 weeks into my new job, I got a message on LinkedIn from Dr. Singh. "Jane, hope you're settling in well at your new position. I have a quick question about the Sterling database. Derek is having trouble locating some trial results from 2019. Could you point me in the right direction?" I stared at the message, considering my response. This was exactly what I'd anticipated. The knowledge gaps were surfacing. I kept my reply friendly but firm. "Hi Dr. Singh, glad to hear from you. Unfortunately, now that I'm at Meridian, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to provide detailed assistance with Sterling's proprietary systems. Derek should be able to find what you need using the documentation guides I created. Best of luck." I hit send and felt a small thrill of satisfaction. They'd made their choice when they refused to value my contributions. Now they could live with it. The messages continued sporadically over the next few weeks. Different people, same desperate tone. Could I help locate a specific document? Did I remember where a certain dataset was stored? How did I handle a particular type of search query? Each time I politely declined, citing my new position and the inappropriateness of helping a competitor. Each time, I imagined Patricia reading the requests and realizing what they'd lost. 2 months after I left Sterling, I heard through industry contacts that they were struggling. The FDA had requested additional documentation for a follow-up audit, and Derek couldn't locate several critical files. They'd hired a consultant to help navigate the database, but even he was having trouble making sense of the architecture. Timelines were slipping. People were panicking. Dr. Singh had apparently pushed for bringing me back as a contractor, but Patricia had refused, probably not wanting to admit the mistake. Meanwhile, Meridian was thriving. My new data management system was operational, and the research team was already reporting significant efficiency gains. Dr. Vargas had praised my work in a company-wide meeting, specifically mentioning how my systems were transforming our research capabilities. I'd been given a project bonus and a clear timeline for promotion to senior analyst. In 3 months at Meridian, I'd received more recognition than in 5 years at Sterling. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sterling had treated my expertise as disposable, something they could replace with a generic hire and some documentation. They were learning the hard way that institutional knowledge, real deep expertise, can't be transferred through manuals and training sessions alone. 6 months after my departure, Sterling posted a job opening. Senior Data Systems Manager. Pharmaceutical industry experience required. The salary range listed was 40% higher than what I'd been making when I left. I showed the posting to Dr. Vargas over coffee, and she laughed out loud. "Let me guess, they're trying to find another you." He nodded. "Looks like it." She shook her head. "They never learn, do they? You don't wait until someone leaves to recognize their value. You invest in them from the start." It was validating to hear that perspective from a leader, something Patricia had never understood. Dr. Vargas had already promoted me to the senior analyst position she'd promised, and we were discussing adding a team member to work under my supervision. "You've built something special here," she said. "I want to make sure you have the resources to grow it." That afternoon I got an email from an unfamiliar address. When I opened it, I saw it was from Patricia, using her personal account. My stomach tightened as I read. "Jane, I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to reach out personally regarding a matter at Sterling that requires your unique expertise." Here we go, I thought. Patricia's email was carefully worded, professional but with an undercurrent of desperation. Sterling was facing significant challenges with data retrieval and system management. Derek had done his best, but lacked my level of familiarity with the systems. They were prepared to offer me a consulting contract, substantial hourly rate, flexible schedule, just to help them through the current crisis. "We realize now how much you contributed to Sterling's success," she wrote. "We'd value the opportunity to work with you again, on terms that properly reflect your expertise." I read the email 3 times, savoring each admission of need disguised as professional courtesy. They'd spent 6 months trying to replace me, failing, and finally admitting defeat. Patricia's signature at the bottom, "With respect and appreciation," felt like a hollow echo of what should have been said 3 years ago. I let the email sit in my inbox for 2 days before responding. Let them wait, the way I'd waited for raises that never came. When I finally replied, I kept it brief. "Patricia, thank you for reaching out. Unfortunately, my commitments at Meridian prevent me from taking on consulting work, especially with a competitor. I'm sure you understand. I hope Sterling finds a solution to its challenges. Best regards, Jane." I copied Dr. Vargas on the response, as a matter of professional transparency. She replied within minutes. "Perfect response. Your loyalty is appreciated." That evening, I sat on my apartment balcony with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. I thought about the journey that had led me here, the frustration, the years of feeling undervalued, the moment of clarity when I decided to leave. It would have been easy to feel bitter, to obsess over the unfairness of how Sterling had treated me. But instead I felt something closer to gratitude. Patricia's decisions had inadvertently set me free. If she'd given me those raises, if she'd recognized my contributions with more than empty praise, I probably would have stayed at Sterling indefinitely. I'd have been comfortable enough to avoid risk, too settled to pursue better opportunities. Her refusals had forced me to recognize my own worth, to bet on myself, to make the leap I'd been too cautious to consider. In trying to hold me down, she'd actually pushed me to fly. The Sterling chapter of my career was closed now, and the Meridian chapter was just beginning. I had a team to build, systems to optimize, and a career trajectory that finally matched my abilities. The knowledge Sterling had taken for granted was now building something better somewhere else. That was the real victory, not revenge but growth. A year after leaving Sterling, I attended a pharmaceutical industry conference where I was scheduled to present on innovative data management systems. As I stood backstage, reviewing my notes, I spotted Patricia in the audience. She hadn't seen me yet, and was too busy networking with other attendees. I felt a flutter of old anxiety, then pushed it down. I wasn't that person anymore, the one who sought her approval or feared her judgment. My presentation went flawlessly. I outlined the data architecture I'd built at Meridian, the efficiency gains we'd achieved, the regulatory advantages of centralized intelligence systems. The audience, mostly research directors and quality managers, asked engaged questions. Several people approached me afterward with business cards, interested in learning more. Patricia was notably absent from that group. She'd left before the Q&A session ended. I wondered if she'd recognized the presentation as essentially a blueprint of what Sterling had lost. That evening, at the conference dinner, I ran into Derek. He looked tired, stressed around the eyes. "Jane, hey. I didn't know you'd be here." We made small talk for a few minutes before he admitted, "It's been rough without you. I finally understand why you were so valuable. The database. There's so much that wasn't in the documentation." Derek and I found a quiet corner of the reception hall, away from the networking buzz. He seemed almost desperate to talk to someone who understood. "They hired 2 people to try to replace you," he confided. "Neither lasted more than 3 months. The systems you built, they're brilliant, but they're like a puzzle that only makes sense if you understand the whole picture at once. I nodded sympathetically. That's the thing about institutional knowledge. It's not just about documentation. It's about context and experience. Derek sighed. Patricia won't admit it, but losing you set the department back at least 2 years. We've had delays on major projects, struggled with audits, lost credibility with the research teams. Dr. Singh still brings up your name in meetings, usually in the context of, when Jane was here, this wouldn't have been a problem. Part of me felt vindicated by his words. But mostly I just felt sad for the people still trapped in that dysfunction. Good scientists and colleagues whose work was being hampered by poor leadership decisions. I hope things improve, I said and meant it. Derek smiled wryly. Me too. But between us, I'm updating my resume. I handed him my business card. Meridian is always looking for good people. 2 years into my tenure at Meridian, I'd been promoted to Director of Research Data Systems, managing a team of 5 analysts and overseeing data operations across 3 departments. Dr. Vargas had made me a key member of the Strategic Planning Committee, and my compensation package reflected my value to the organization. It was everything Sterling should have been and never was. I heard occasional updates about Sterling through industry channels. They'd finally stabilized their data systems, but only after hiring expensive consultants and rebuilding significant portions of the infrastructure I'd created. Patricia had moved to a different company, a lateral move that industry gossip suggested wasn't entirely voluntary. Derek had indeed left, landing at a smaller biotech firm where he was reportedly much happier. Dr. Singh had taken early retirement, frustrated with the organizational chaos. Sterling survived but diminished. They'd lost market position to competitors like Meridian who'd invested in their people and infrastructure. It was a cautionary tale that got discussed at industry events. The company that had saved pennies on raises only to spend millions fixing the problems created by undervalued talent departures. I never mentioned my role in that story publicly, but people who knew the details understood. On the 5-year anniversary of leaving Sterling, I treated myself to dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown. As I sat by the window, watching the city lights sparkle against the darkening sky, I reflected on the journey. The version of me who'd opened that rejection email 5 years ago, disappointed, undervalued, uncertain, felt like a different person entirely. That Jane had known her worth but hadn't fully believed it. She'd needed permission from others to value herself. The current version of me had learned a harder but more valuable lesson. Your worth isn't determined by whether others recognize it. It's determined by what you do with your talents, regardless of external validation. Patricia's rejections hadn't diminished my value. They just revealed her inability to see it. The knowledge I'd built over 5 years at Sterling wasn't theirs just because I'd been on their payroll. It was mine, earned through dedication and skill, and I'd taken it with me to build something better. My phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Vargas. Congrats on the 5-year milestone. Lunch tomorrow to discuss the VP track. I smiled, typed absolutely, and sent it. The best revenge, I'd learned, wasn't dwelling on past injustices. It was building a future so successful that those injustices became irrelevant footnotes in a much larger story. Sterling had taught me what I didn't want. Meridian was teaching me what was possible. And that knowledge, the kind that comes from experience, growth, and self-belief, was something nobody could block or take away.